caught my daddy in the woods last night. Said they saw his shining light, said they heard his rifle clear. He shot the rich man's deer. He shot the rich man's deer. They call me a redneck, poacher's son. Tell them I'm proud to be one. I'll see you down the barrel of my gun. I'll see you down the barrel of my gun.
Luke Wallin, welcome to the Smoke Trail.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Love that song, and it's got a lot of meaning as we enter this dialogue here. That was a song you wrote that in parallel to, or kind of around the same time, a little bit right before the creative juices started flowing for your first actual novel that you published.
That's right. I had a sort of a half of a draft, and I was having struggles with it, and a lot of things came together one night, and I wrote that song about one of the characters, the main character. And when I did that, it just opened up a whole new way of getting into the characters and expressing what they felt. And it really made the novel possible. So I feel like, without my songwriting, maybe not my career as a novelist.
That's awesome. I love that. And we're going to come back to that whole creative process, but just by way of welcoming you and welcoming our audience to participate in this dialogue here, I always like to say up front my intentions and kind of our intentions of what we're here talking about. And we were talking off camera, so I'll try to replicate what I said to you. But essentially, as I have gone down my own spiritual journey, which we're dubbing the Smoke Trail, I have experienced tremendous benefits in my inner peace, unconditional love, and consciousness level. As my consciousness level has increased, I have had direct benefits. And part of what has come on this journey for me, as I have become more and more conscious, is something inside, which is I have a need, is maybe not the right word, but a overflowing abundance of energy to share what I have learned, and to, if it's useful, to share ways in which others can unlock this. So my intention with the Smoke Trail is simply that. It's to share a bit of my journey, not to tell anyone how to do their journey, but to the degree what I have encountered, experienced, learned along the way that could be helpful, that I might have found helpful at one point along the way had I had someone in my shoes sharing, I'm attempting to make available and share in this forum. And although some of the episodes are just Smoke talking about the Smoke Trail and that journey and sharing directly my own experience, I also have invited select guests who are also on their own journey, because we're all on our own path to whatever this enlightenment or spiritual journey might be for each of us, and to enter dialogue around meaningful topics. And one of the things that I said earlier, and that I want to just kind of say here on camera, because I think it's a useful frame. If you think about the conversation that you might have at a coffee shop, Starbucks or whatever, with someone, or someone in line at the grocery store, even if it's a very friendly conversation, and both parties are kind of like leaning in to be nice, the level of depth that you might get into is typically quite shallow. And if we look at all interactions, all discussion, all sharing that we might have in our lives, on a bell curve, where you've got kind of the bulk of them are in the middle, which might be a lot like that coffee shop conversation, and then some of them might be out there on the ends, kind of at the ends of the bell curve. The upper 5%, the bottom 5%. And those are, the kinds of things where if you really knew me, you would know blah, blah, blah. If you really knew me, you would know this, that, and the other thing. So these are more things that we reserve and hold back. And so part of my hope and objective in the dialogues here is for us to be comfortable enough to have some sharing that we might not otherwise do. It's not a coffee shop conversation, although it could happen in a coffee shop. It's more about sharing a deeper level.
It kind of is today, actually.
It is today, and I have my my coffee here as well, my afternoon coffee here in beautiful Sedona, and I know you are in the lustrous, beautiful winter wonderland of Little Compton, Rhode Island, and so let's go to there for a second, because Little Compton is just this magical little coastal town that you have been in for a long time. So why Little Compton? What's behind your window? What are we looking at there? I know you spent a lot of time out there. So tell us a little bit about your environment.
Yeah. It's a wonderful place, this little town. I came here with my wife and two kids in 1988 because I got a job teaching in the English department at the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth, which in those days was called Southeastern Massachusetts University. And it was a wonderful experience being there. And I was there for 20 years. That was after an earlier 20 years of teaching in different places. And so I'm still here. It's a great place to write. It's a great place to play music. I'm about a little over a mile from the Atlantic Ocean. So, it's a great place to meditate. And I have personal relationships with some of the animals here, some of the birds.
All right, well, let's not jump ahead. We're going to get to that, I think. But so you're about an hour from Boston, roughly, give or take, depending on time of day, and maybe an hour from Providence. So kind of in the middle of those two cities, but
Right.
in a very rural setting.
Right.
Awesome. Well, I wanted you to describe that a little bit, because although it's far, far away from where the redneck poacher's son grew up and experienced the poachers and his whole life in that whole world that you so beautifully described and brought me to as a young reader and many readers over the years, that you brought that world to life. Well, you grew up in that world or around that world. Maybe you weren't Jesse. Your dad wasn't the redneck poacher alcoholic who Jesse had to come to grips with that being his family, but you certainly knew a lot of Jesse's and Jesse's dads in your world. And I was, one of the things that I really was struck by, and what I love about this process is the pre-questions that I ask my guests to answer always bring out interesting things in most cases, and you can speak to it yourself, but it helps the person answering the questions recontextualize things in their lives around kind of with a meaningful lens. And I know you did. And, part of the story that you told in your in one of the questions was, just your life in that world. And, growing up in Mississippi, hunting, the whole change of the hunting style and what went on, that was news to me. That was an interesting, really whole thing. I'd love to maybe discuss that a little bit. But the important thing was that at 16 years old, you and your buddy Dennis and one other pal decided that you were against the hunts where they drove the deer with dogs and everybody was waiting to shoot them in a field somewhere. And you asked that let's not let people do that on our land. And you guys had a bunch of woods back then. And your dad at the time, who was, quite a prominent business person in that community, respected your request, and stopped allowing people to do it. And that created all kinds of turmoil or enemies and all kinds of stuff. So tell us a little bit about that. Bring us back to that moment when, like, what made you guys decide that you were that the kind of hunting that everybody was doing was not right, and why'd you ask your father to disallow it?
Yeah. So I was born in 1943 in Mississippi, and completely fell in love with the woods, with fishing, with hunting, and I didn't like town. I didn't like the sense of secrets that town had. I liked being alone. I liked being in the woods. And I tried to connect that a lot with biblical stuff about the woods and the hunting in the Old Testament. And so, yeah, there's a lot. I wrote about that in answering your questions. And so I was, my friends and I were in the woods. And this was at the age when we were just starting to deer hunt. It was around 14, 15. And the dominant method was people would bring a lot of horses and dogs, and they had these giant events, and they would put standers out on logging roads through the woods, people with shotguns. And then they would ride these horses and with the dogs, and they would make a lot of noise on purpose. And they'd drive down through the woods and jump the deer out of the thickets, scare the deer to death. The deer would run past the standers. The standers would shoot at them with their shotguns, and they would, they had to use buckshot. And so some of the buckshot would get into the tough skin of the deer. The deer would keep going. And then the deer would often be wounded and be tracked down by the dogs. And it was a big mess, and it was cruel. And there was, at that time, a general feeling of resistance to that. And as I mentioned, I was in the library in my hometown one time, and I found a letter that had been written by William Faulkner in probably the early 40s. And he was complaining about this driving of deer and how cruel it was, and how it'd be so much better if people would just hunt with a rifle and in the quiet, and be careful with their shots, and be more humane about the whole thing. And then he concluded that this was years away. People were not ready for this. This would take many more years. And so the first year that I was able to go deer hunting, and I went on one of these huge drives, and I killed an enormous buck, and it was this big event. But then the following year, my friends and I, we were trying to figure out how we could not have this stuff going on. And my father was a sawmill man. He had a sawmill, and he owned some forest land. And so he had been letting people drive across our land for years as part of these big drives, which was a normal thing. All the landowners in the river bottom would say, okay, you can do this. So I asked him if he would tell them no, and we would just hunt on our land, and they would have to go around us. This caused a lot of trouble.
Was his initial reaction like he just accepted it, or did he make you make your case, or why you wanted to do it, why you wanted to stop?
I think I had been making my case for a couple of years.
Okay, it wasn't instant.
So he knew how I felt about the whole. He knew how important it was to me. I don't think he wanted to do it. I think he knew there would be some blowback from this. And I was actually surprised that he was willing to do this for me, but he did. And the first time that it happened, you know, my friends and I were down there, and we were like just inside our land, sort of monitoring things.
Mm-hmm.
And these guys would come, and they would, and there were barbed wire fences. They come up to the barbed wire fences, and they were used to going through there. I forget exactly why there was, whether we had put up some barbed wire or what it was. In one case, they drove a buck over on us, and my pal shot that buck, and then the buck was wounded and ran back across the line into where they were, and that's where he died. And then we went over there, and they said, you know what, they were so mad at us, and they were so mad at us. And then so there was a dispute about who got that deer, who should own that deer.
Yeah.
So it got pretty hot, and somebody who wanted to be kind of a peacemaker said, well, look, let us bring that deer down to our camp and hang it up and be part of the celebration of the hunt at the end of the day with the other deer that we're going to kill. And then you guys can come and take it home. And we said, okay. So that's what happened there. But when we went down there to get the deer, they were waiting for us. There were like 100 people mad at me. Some of them very mad at me. And so that set the tone for having some landline enemies. And if anybody has grown up in deer country, hunting and either owning land or being part of a club that controls some land, you will know that everybody has enemies. Everybody's always trying to do something to make it harder for the guy across the line.
Well, let's talk about that. I could talk about. I would love to hear more of those stories, but what I like to do is, let's think about that for a minute. You grew up in, probably a situation that was, unique to you, but also quite common across lots of people and societies. And there were cliques and groups and tribes, if you will, of people. And
right.
You were probably in the higher echelon of your community because of your father's business, success. But you were, right up against everyone else and connected with everyone. And, you guys were all in it together. And this whole idea of having enemies and tribes and affinities, and it's a level of consciousness that humans have to go through, and that in developed situations they get beyond that. And we've actually, you and I have had, we should reveal that we've had ongoing discussions along these lines of this topic or this today's dialogue that have not been for the public. But one of those things is forgiveness. And I went through a process of unlocking memories, unlocking trauma that happened to me through different times in my life, and understanding it, and giving up the attraction and aversion of my ego mind to those experiences, giving up the payoff of I have a grudge, or I hold this against these people who did these things to me or that I experienced. And in that process, I this well, but I've came to an unlocking of a whole bunch of understanding, and it was through forgiveness. So I use that like as a scalpel, if you will, like Hawkins talks about, like the forgiveness scalpel cuts away all this other stuff that just falls away. But I know you've had some experiences as well. As we've thought about that, there is no situation that the person who holds the anger, resentment, grudge, whatever you want to call it, won't benefit from forgiveness, because the forgiveness is not for the forgivee. It's not for
Right.
it's not for the enemy. It's not for the person that did it. It's not for the, it's for the person who who gave the forgiveness. In so doing, you have your freedom. So how do you think about that? I know we've talked about it, but you went back and forgave old enemies at some point in this process. What was that like?
That's very true. It's all very true. And I think when somebody hears this idea of forgiving your enemies, especially if they have enemies, it sounds crazy. Because like you say, there is a payoff. It adds drama to life. When I was had met my wife, and in the early days, I'd be talking about my enemies, and she said, "What is this? You have enemies? What's this about?" She was from New York, and and I said, "Oh yeah." And there were two different contexts in which I was very familiar with people having enemies in tribes. One was hunting, and the other was academia.
Yeah.
Man,
That's a good question. Who was worse and more vengeful, the rednecks that didn't like you closing off your land, or the other professors in the department who didn't like that you published something and that you spoke out at a faculty meeting?
well, I would say that the hunters, the landowners, they would get pretty hot about things, and they would have grudges and stuff, but not every day. But the professors do it every day.
But of course they would be offended by us comparing them.
Well, they wouldn't even know what we're talking about.
Right. Right. Well, and that's another thing that we have talked a lot about, and I think that this would be something worth surfacing. And then I'm going to circle back. I'm going to jump around timeline wise, but I think in this understanding that we have come to at various levels, each of us independently, but like we've come to this understanding of a lot of what we experience as humans is what our ego mind has made up, and that that is our identity for much of our lives. For many people, that's their identity their entire life. But once you understand what the ego mind is about, and I think you and I share a like of David Hawkins with his Power versus Force and a bunch of his other books, where he really did a good job of articulating these levels of consciousness and the ego mind aversions and attractions that happen at every level of conscious, which are these payoffs, right? It's the payoff for being the victim, holding a grudge against someone that did you wrong 20 years ago, the payoff of being in grief for the loss of that parent or child or spouse or whatever that you had 10 years ago, and you're still grieving. It's the payoff of that grief that the ego mind goes to, and why it regurgitates it. And that's an idea, as you said, like a lot of these folks might not appreciate this whole conversation, but once you see it, it's like, oh, that's what that is. I can unlock that. That's a really powerful thing. Let's see if we can flesh that out a little bit and see if maybe you could say what I'm trying to say in a different way.
Well, yeah, let me say something about putting this in. So we're talking right now about if you're in this mentality where you do have enemies, how can you see your way through that, and how can you actually forgive people, and how can you get out of that? How can you move beyond that, right?
Yeah.
Because a lot of people hearing this would say, oh, well, that would be nice. That would be nice. Everybody would just forgive their enemies and go and move beyond it. But that son of a bitch, let me tell you what he did. So here, let me put this in a little bit of a context of how what happened with me even before I started hunting. when I was 7 years old. We had lived in town in a fairly cramped house, and we moved out into the edge of the country. We were like a mile away. We were up on a top of a hill. There was big woods behind us. You could see like a mile away to the river. There were cornfields in the distance, and these tall pine trees. It was really rural where we moved to, quiet. And in those days, there was no light pollution. So when you go out at night, the stars were incredibly bright. So at 7 years old, I was introduced to this magical world of nature. And we had a very protected back garden. We had the top of this hill, we had fence around it. And I was able to roam around out there with my dog. I had this great little dog, Ginger. And we were able to roam around and spend a lot of time out there alone. And, we really watching the ants and watching the quail and listening to everything. And so everything was so vivid, and especially looking at the stars at night. And I had the feeling that those stars were being created continuously as I was watching them. I was seeing the original creation of everything. That's the trees, everything. And it was not that it could happen once and then, okay, it's created. And when I got to that story in Genesis, that the whole thing was done in a week. It was so deflating. It was like, I had the feeling of what was going on during that week, but it's still going on in my feelings.
Yeah, it's constantly going on, right? Everything is constantly in creation of each moment. And yeah, I think that's the frame that we all get. I didn't grow up in a very religious situation, as you know, that you did. You were in a heart of the Southern Baptist world, a very upstanding family in that world. You guys were, I think you said, going to church 3 times a week. So how did that, you had this unbelievable insight as a 7-year-old, recognizing the divine creation of nature and what was happening in real time, but having, of course, no frame or way to talk about it, no one to talk about it to, and then being bombarded and inundated with the gospel from the perspective of the Southern Baptist scripture.
Right. So it started out with just me and Ginger, my dog, and we really
Ginger understood.
Was that?
Ginger got it.
She did.
Yeah.
We really loved each other, and I can remember being out there with her, and I would put my hand on her head, and it was warm, and I could just feel the love flowing between us, right? And at the same time, I could look at the stars, and I could see them being created. So the whole power of the universe, the whole force of the universe, there it was. Things were coming into being. The unmanifest was becoming manifest. I didn't have this vocabulary, of course, but the combination of feeling the tenderness of Ginger, the love of Ginger, and the power of the entire universe producing stars at every moment, that combination was thrilling. But how can a 7-year-old talk about that, right? So you go along, and then church comes along, and Baptists come along, and then they have this whole framework. They want you to think about Genesis, but the big thing is when you're 8 and you're approaching 9, then they give you the health scare, because 9 is considered the age of accountability. So if you're accidentally killed after you become 9 and you haven't yet accepted Jesus, you go to hell for eternity.
Yeah.
This is a frightening thought to an 8-year-old approaching 9. And so
it's a frightening thought to anyone, I think, and it it's a great illustration. Um, Again, I'm not here to judge anybody's religion, and that's not what this is about or the show is about. That being said, I am, and I think I choose to freely make observations when I see different things like religion living in a certain level of development. And so a lot of that teaching, the stuff, the Revelation book, which we know now, thanks to Hawkins' research, that calibrates below integris, right? The Revelations, was brings the entire Bible down because of its lack of integrity, right? So, like, and if you take that book literally, then you're telling 8, 9-year-olds that they're gonna burn in eternal hell if they don't find Jesus, because it's coming. So it's just interesting, as we look at the development of all the religions from their essence, which was where they started, say the Christ or the Buddha or Krishna, Zoroaster, or others. I always like to throw Zoroaster in there because I don't think he gets a lot of credit these days, but he was one of those also founders of the early religions. Their teachings absolutely integrous and aligned with truth and a knowingness of what is real. And then you look at what humans did around those religions, aka example of Southern Baptist 9-year-old boy being told fire and brimstone and being told you have to find Jesus or you will burn in hell.
right.
It's really quite interesting to take a step back and just look at those. So
So
it's
you, so you want you want to find Jesus. You want, and there are these two prongs of the thing. You first of all you kind of believe all this stuff because there's no alternative worldview, and so you want to believe it because your parents are telling you they believed it. They don't really, you don't really understand why they never talk about it, but okay, you still think they believe it, whatever that means. So you want to believe it, but the other thing is that you definitely don't want to go to hell. So you want to get with the program. You want to figure out what it means to accept Jesus, to be saved, to be able to go and publicly tell the preacher, "I've been saved," and the preacher then will schedule your baptism. And you'll be publicly baptized in front of the whole congregation, and then you're in the club.
yeah.
Yeah, and you're in the best deer club.
Well, let's now. I want to bring it in just so we're keeping people on here. We were talking about forgiveness and talking about unlocking things and this understanding of by forgiving you are forgiven, you're freed up, and how that would even make sense to someone. And you said rightly, well, let's put it in terms of someone who's like, well, that sounds great, but how would I even think about this? And so now we went down the path of this. So a lot of us have you have your story, I have my story, we all have stories, and our stories are not necessarily aren't us, they are what we experienced. And understanding the difference between the two is part of this understanding of ego mind and separating yourself from the uh the I guess all encompassing situation that we find ourselves in, which is this life, this human existence, where I'm looking at you on a camera, I'm looking out here at, you can see the Sedona Mountains, and visually I think 90% of our awake mentation is from visual stuff, and then all the other senses bring in the rest. You layer in the sixth sense, as Buddha said, our thinkingness, which is which is just another form of sense that we have in this form, and you've got all these things that make us forget who we really are and identify with this existence.
Right. Right. And so what I started out with feelings that I would now identify as spiritual. And then I was sort of scooped up like everyone else into religion. And I was always trying to have both. I mean, I went a long way with both. You know, I went so far as to have a call to preach, and I preached in the maximum security ward of the prison in Jackson, Mississippi, and things like that. And but at the same and then but to be closer to nature, to be closer to my feelings of spirituality, that's where hunting came in. I got away from society, got away from other people, except for my buddies, and we didn't want to hunt in that manner of the deer drives because we wanted to have a solitary experience, and we justified it various ways. But think for a second what we were doing. We were still this was sport hunting, which means you're killing things for pleasure. Hang on, how spiritual can that be? Right now, when I was coming up in the early 50s, nobody in the state of Mississippi ever said that there was anything wrong with killing an animal.
Right.
That was not a thought that anybody ever expressed. There were plenty of people who felt that way, and they would say, "Oh, I don't like hunting. I don't want to hunt." And they were classified as kind of sissies, or even enlightened sissies. But there was no point of view being expressed that would say animal life is sacred.
It's a great example, Luke, of I think the mistake a lot of us make in modern society, and whatever time it is, let's just date stamp, let's say this is 2025, and we're looking back at activities you're talking about the 50s. We could look back in historically, thousands of years, different activities. We could look back at, the 80s or the 90s or the even 2000. You can always look back from the current mindset, which, fortunately, some would say, unfortunately not enough, but fortunately is advancing overall. Like, there is a higher level of consciousness that exists today than existed 10 years ago and 20 years ago. Although we could certainly find plenty of people who would argue why, that may not be true, but it is true. And that being said, then that lens of that taking that lens and applying it to something that happened many years ago, and then judging, there's the mistake. It's not having the lens and like looking at it in perspective and saying, "Oh, isn't that funny? Nobody would have even thought that hunting would be bad for sport back then." Or maybe some people thought it, but they certainly wouldn't have said it. That was just the way it was. And yet, to see that and have, I guess, compassion, a bit of understanding, that is where it was, and they were probably a lot more conscious and less in those lower realms of thinking than their predecessors. Looking back another 50 years or 70 years in the 1800s and what was going on. I mean, we can look at it in this country and the abolition of slavery, and that this country went through. Obviously, was not only the right thing to do. It was incredibly important to do. But it's slavery's been going on in humanity since the beginning of humanity, and it's still happening in parts of the world. And it has nothing to do with this race or that race. It has everything to do with low levels of consciousness and people taking advantage, using power or force to force other people to do things. So I'm going down a rabbit hole of that, but it is about the lens that we look back on and whether or not we judge and how we look at that. And that, I think, that ties to this forgiveness thing, because I didn't get the forgiveness by saying, the things that I experienced, the trauma that I experienced, the, you know, whether it was child abuse or other things that I saw, that I experienced, because, and by saying, oh, it was okay, like what people did around me or what I experienced was okay. It is not condoning, but it is being able to get to a lens of being able to ask the question, what happened to you? What happened to them? What happened to the people that would allow them to do these things, perpetrate these acts, that would let someone operate at that level of conscious? And you know, that question unlocks things to say, okay, of course you can forgive them. It's a different context, right? It's looking back at that same situation, and you looking back at your enemy in the woods, you know, who, you know, was your arch enemy in high school, and, you know, said bad things about you. And I think we had this conversation that, you know, you realize that, like, actually, yeah, you did still have a grudge about this one person. I can't remember, you know, who it was, but it was somebody, and you consciously went and forgave them. And I think they had already passed away, I think. But that unlocked things for you.
Right. You the what one of the mysteries about forgiveness and about getting past having grudges is, yeah, but what about the things this person did? And that's not an easy thing to solve. I wouldn't want to say that I have a theory about evil that actually explains it in a satisfactory way. You know, a lot of people, all the way from Plato to Jesus, would say, you know, forgive them, for they know not what they do. It's ignorance that causes people to act so badly, and it looks like evil, but it's really ignorance. Well, that works for a lot of situations. I don't know if it works for all situations, though. You know, I mean, Hawkins says even Hitler thought he was being of service. And
Right. Well, it was, yes.
but I'm
Yeah.
just saying that's a hard thing to swallow. And I'm not saying that
Well, the question is, Luke, the question is service to whom? And, you know, it's the service to self or service to something greater than your selfish self, right? And so, yeah, I mean, every act could be seen as, um, you know, choosing. I think Aristotle might have said, and you're as your whole philosopher chapter, you've got depth and knowledge of that I do not. But I think he said that, you know, everyone makes what they feel is the best choice, the best decision, right? The best. They always, everyone thinks they're making the best decision. Now, notwithstanding, like, you have a, you know, you're in a situation and you know you're making a bad decision, you know, like, and so some part of you knows it's not right, but you think that's the best choice in that situation because you're threatened, because of repercussions. I mean, look, I think there's so many in society, there are so many examples of people going down a wrong path and making perhaps one shortcut, one quote wrong decision, but they didn't think it was that bad. And then it's always the cover up. It's always the, how do you get out of it, that turns into the big scandal, and that brings people down and brings organizations down, that brings, whole societies down. It's the, how do you, you know, make up for this one act or whatever. And you think you're doing something good to do that because you're protecting your family, you're protecting your wealth, your lifestyle, your whatever. And it's about a hierarchy of, like, what is important to you. And so I'm not going to say, I don't think we're going to, this could be a second conversation, because I think we could get into this in quite some meaningful depth. But, you know, I think the way I have come to understand it is, you know, we're either ascending or descending. And, you know, as a you know, world, we are ascending. We're in an ascending time. So, which means we're coming back to divinity. We're coming back to God. We're coming back to cosmic heart. We're coming back to universal consciousness, and we're on our way there. That's what's happening. We are.
Right. And as you said before, the person who benefits the most from forgiveness is the forgiver.
Yes.
So, and all I'm saying about this, the problem of evil is, I don't stand before anybody and say that I have an understanding of the problem of evil. Why does God allow evil? I cannot answer that. I I think that business of saying, people are ignorant and therefore they do evil things. That's true for many people, but there are people who like cruelty. There are people.
Well, again, let me try to finish my thought here, because we're ascending, right, and that's like heading toward God, heading toward what is the highest good for all, and there are people, entities, who choose self over other, self over God, and they like something, they want to hoard it, they want to maximize their own personal value. They don't see the divine. They're ignorant of the bigger picture. Because you could not make these choices, and if you were not ignorant of that. So like that, it definitionally, I get to, you couldn't be evil if you actually understood the repercussions of it to your, eternal soul, your karma, whatever you want to believe, in your tradition. But
Yeah.
everything in the universe, every thought, every emotion, every act, every hair on our heads is recorded, is captured by the energies of the universe. And once you understand that, and I say it from an understanding of, it's not because I read it in a book. It is the way it works. It actually is. It is a knowingness of, like, this is actually what's happening. How it does it, I'm not here to tell anyone that, because it's beyond our human comprehension. And we can go down rabbit holes of like how this actually works. But I don't. I've said this to you before. I don't need to know how to build a jet to fly from Sedona to, from Phoenix to Boston. I don't need to know how to build it. I don't need to know how to fly it. I just need to know how to buy a ticket, get on a plane, and get there and get off it, and I'm there. I don't need to know how this happens and exactly how the universe works to know that it is working and it is true. So back to this evil and ignorance thing. If you're ignorant of these universal laws, you can go back to the Hermetic laws. If you don't want to get religious, don't. I like that. You look at the 7 laws of the Hermetic, principles, and every force, there are counter forces. There's reactions to everything. So every act you commit you're either going to have the repercussion in this existence, or it's going to come in a future existence. So it's not, we can't see all the dynamics around what brought someone to make a certain decision, what caused them to, do a certain thing. We might see pieces of it. We might see, someone who had a terrible background, or someone who had, crimes committed against them, and then they in turn start doing it to other people. So we see that all the time. And so we can say, oh, that had something to do with it. But we don't see all the factors, right? We don't.
But what I'm trying to say is that I think that you can understand people who like to be cruel, by the analogy with addiction. People can become addicted to a lot of things, not only to substances, but to gambling, to sex, and they can become addicted to cruelty as well. And when they reach that point, it's not a matter of what they think anymore. It's not a matter of, if they knew enough, they wouldn't do this. They just are caught up in this madness of addiction.
Yeah, well, that I love that. So all right, so let's let's dig in that a little bit here.
Yeah.
Because I think it's something that it took me quite a bit of work to gain an understanding of. And I think you and I have had a lot of great dialogues around this. So maybe we can flesh it out a little bit. Because, there's this whole, academic debate about does free will exist or not. And there's experiments that show it doesn't. I would put forth that there are pieces of it that are real, and then there are pieces of it that aren't real or don't exist. And it depends on your level of consciousness. So yes, there's free will, but in certain contexts and in other contexts, there's no free will. And that gets back to what you're saying is like, you are the field of level of consciousness that you are. So we all have a center of gravity, and that center of gravity starts out somewhere on of a consciousness level, even as a child. And over time, we're on this journey to discover that we can affect that if we can learn lessons to the degree we can embody those lessons, that we can integrate those learnings, that those insights, those understandings, we can progress, and we can move up that scale of consciousness to different levels. And in so doing, we move from one field of thought to another field of thoughts. So even when we're progressing, we're really, the thoughts aren't necessarily our own. They are the thoughts of that level of consciousness. And so the best example, I think a good example is what you're saying, like addiction or, but low levels of consciousness where people are stuck in grief, or they're stuck in sorrow, or a higher level, they're stuck in anger. And that anger level of consciousness is going to produce certain thoughts. Depression and grief is going to produce certain thoughts, and those are not unique to any of these people. They're just the thoughts when you are at that level of vibration, of that energetic level of consciousness. You're going to have thoughts of despair, and these thoughts that are like common across everybody who's depressed. It's the same.
And not only is like desiring to do cruel things a kind of addiction, more than it is a theory that somebody has. But the way out of these kind of addictions is also not through theory, not through thinking so much. It's more through feeling, and it's more through. There are things you can understand. You can come to understand about how feeling works in the universe, and how your own thoughts actually create forms and create forces that they may not have a great effect, but they will have everything that you think, every emotion that you put out there is going to go into a field with all those thoughts and feelings from the other people. And so,
well, and look, that's exactly why the 12-step groups like Alcoholics Anonymous and others that have built on that,
right,
why they actually do work, and why when they don't work for someone, it's almost inevitably that they stop going to the meeting. So there's a field of energy that is that those groups, which really exist at a unconditional love level of consciousness. Like it's everybody comes broken, and everybody accepts everyone else, and you have to admit it to enter the field and be part of the group. You have to acknowledge it, and then you can then you can start your journey of all their steps that they do. But that is a higher level of energy than someone who is in that state of addiction has personally. It's not personal will. You cannot just wake up one day and say, I am not going to be an alcoholic anymore. You have to actually ask for help, and you'll receive it. And
right.
And that group, I just want to just finish this one little thing and then hear your riff on it. That energetic field that's at that unconditional love is so much higher and so much more powerful than that low level shame, anger, lower level consciousness that that say an alcoholic was in, and was living in, and constantly shaming themselves, right? Constantly why did I do that? Why did I do that? Do it again. Why did I do that? Why did I do it again? And the way they break out of that field is the higher energy field of that unconditional love of that group. And it's not linear. It's an energy field that breaks them up to the next level. So as we think about these thoughts are not our own, these fields of feelings that you point out rightly, it's not just understanding. Understanding this is useful along the way, because we have thinking minds, and it helps us, especially. And the smarter you are, the more it is useful to understand how to unlock this. But no level of smartness will actually let you break free of some of these fields without the divine intervention, and which you can ask for.
Right. And just like somebody in a 12-step group needs those other people in the group to make this work. Anybody who's trying to make any kind of progress spiritually needs at least one person that they can talk to about it. And as Hawkins points out, most people never even meet another person in their entire lifetime who's really interested in enlightenment. So
yeah,
but
I also think that's changing, right? Like I know it from my world. One of the reasons, one of my hopes and aspirations of what is a part of process is, I see an awakening happening. I see more and more leaders. My circle of kind of friends are this, CEO business world that I have grown up in and been in for a long time. And I see a lot of awakening. I see a lot of people asking real questions about what is there. People who have, like, what you would on the outside you would say they have everything. They have all these houses and all this wealth and all this success and maybe fame also in some cases. And then I see them broken. Their marriages aren't good. Their children are going off the rails and having problems. Their level of satisfaction in their day-to-day life is terrible. And if I turn off the radio, I turned off the TV, I turned off the internet, and put your phone away, they in some cases would suffer greatly from the quiet. It would just be intolerable to be able to sit with their own thoughts. And what I see is, not everybody, of course, but an awakening that's happening on I think, a broad base. One of my objectives is you wouldn't get to this far in this discussion if you weren't having some of those feelings anyway. Like, you're not going to listen to this interview if you aren't interested in this topic. So you're already on the path. So can we help people unlock for themselves this path to a much greater outcome for themselves, and for obviously all of society? Because the more we can move up in transcend the levels of consciousness, the better it is for everyone.
exactly.
It's a shared field.
Exactly. And one thing is that people hear stuff like this and they think that meditation is incredibly difficult. They think making any kind of spiritual progress is hard. And they think they could never get away from the clutter of their own minds. It's just too cluttered. It's just thoughts. They think this stuff. But the thing is that it's actually easy to make progress, and it's painless, and it feels so good. And all you have to do really is relax and ask for help.
Yeah, asking for help is a big one, right? Like, there is a higher power. It will come. Like, for me, I was in Nepal. You've heard the story, but quickly, I was in Nepal. I was in Buddha's birthplace. I was in a temple. Wasn't religious, spiritual, or I was a pretty happy, successful guy. And yet something was off. And I was like, I just had this feeling come over me. I'm like, I asked for peace and love. And it wasn't like relationship love. It was like a real level of love, of universal love. It was like this feeling in my heart that, like, why do I have this anxiety? And electric shock came through my body, up my back, into my head, and out. And it was, it was the divine intervention. I asked the Buddha for help in that case, but I got it, and that led me on this whole journey. So you have to ask for help, but if you ask
Right.
for help, it's there. You'll get it. It'll show up in another person. It'll show up in an experience. It'll show up in a book. It'll show up in, everything for me is now like, okay, I am beyond. I am more and more. So it's never perfect because it's always easy to revert to old habits and to, we're humans. So our human mind likes to think about the past and regurgitate it. That's what usually causes depression and sadness, and because you're second guessing things, or we are jumping ahead and worrying about what's going to happen next, what's going to happen wrong, what's going to happen this, worried about the bills, worried about this, and that's anxiety. So anxiety and depression are our ego minds spending time in the past or the future. And if we stay present, the now, right, the instantaneous now, none of that exists, and everything manifests from this moment. And so if you can stay in that moment, if you can stay in that and not let your mind wander, which is why meditation is so good for you once you can get beyond the wandering mind, because it allows you to see reality for what it really is and dropping the expectation. So where I'm going with this is, by staying in that moment, we have the opportunity to just witness and experience what the universe is bringing us. And it's good. The universe is bringing us things for our own good. Now, that it may not be understandable at different levels, because it could be something where, in a prior life, there was some crime committed, some murder committed, or whatever, and then you have to experience it to learn. You have to experience the other way. You have to experience going through it. So there's all kinds of levels of this kind of karmic recycling of things. But as we progress, everything's coming at us because, we agreed to this. We're here. We're lucky. We are the lucky entities that have agreed to this life to be able to learn and experience these things so that we can move up the level of consciousness. And it is why we're here. And so when you think about that, and you can stay in that center place, which is admittedly super hard to do, everything that happens is for a reason. Everything's happening is opening up an opportunity. So now I'm like, okay, why did I just meet this person at the checkout counter? Why am I in this line? Why am I at this trail? And I just met this Japanese couple who are hiking with their baby. Am I supposed to talk to them? Why? So you can go to extremes with this, but everything, there is something in it for us, and it's up to us to figure it out.
I know, and the more you become aware of this, and the more you do ask for help, the more you see these synchronicities happening. But
Do you think the synchronicities have been happening all along and we just didn't see them, or do you think they start happening because you are you're in this space?
Well, I think that 85% of them have been happening all along.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with you.
Yeah.
we didn't notice them.
But the minute you start asking for help,
yeah,
that's where the other 15 come in so fast. And
yeah.
and the thing is that I want to say about for people who are back at the beginning of this, and they're thinking, well, this would be nice, but how do you do it? Okay, the very first step you start with is to express gratitude for everything that the world is. Thank you to the flower. Thank you to the sky. Express gratitude. Quite a few.
And you never stop doing that, right? I think you're right. It's the first step, and it's the ongoing step. If you can keep that in mind, I do it every day.
Right, me too. And for me, it goes right back to that 7-year-old. My goodness, the stars are being created. I can see that they're being created.
Yeah.
And so there's that gratitude thing. All right, that's the first step. The second step is to say, okay, everyone who's done me wrong, I forgive them. Now, the first time you say that, you'll almost laugh. Say that, what did I say? What could that possibly mean?
Yeah.
But if you say it and you think about it, that's a start. That's just a start. Okay.
Yeah.
And then the another thing that to me was a gateway as far as meditation and all the things that can come from that is Rupert Spira, who's got all these great YouTube videos. And what he does over and over again is he explains that when you sit quietly and you look at anything or you think of anything, you can learn to notice the difference between the witness that you are, witnessing the scene in the field or witnessing the thoughts or the memories or the feelings in your body. There's a pure witness of self. And if you can learn to appreciate that, and you will realize that witness is calm. It's fantastically calm. It's impersonal in a way. And once you get onto that, once you really appreciate that, and you can go in and sort of enjoy that, then you begin to realize that everything that you're witnessing, it brings you a kind of pleasure. There's something about being, all kinds of beingness, that when you just witness it without wanting anything from it, without wanting to manipulate it, but just anything that you are aware of, be aware of the calmness and the impersonality of the witness self and of the joy that you can feel just from the beingness of anything. And that's just a gateway. I mean, there's much more to this, but Rupert was really helpful for me to begin to be able to meditate and to have more of an insight into the structure of my own mind. I was very lucky to have this feeling from childhood about the world, that it was being created. It was magic.
Yeah. You were already there. You just didn't know what there was.
Right. I couldn't find anybody to talk to about it. And then of course, religion.
That's an important thing, I think, that I have experienced is, and I, as I've been doing this, I've run across a lot of people and, all kinds of different traditions. I think Rupert does a really nice job of simplifying things and helping you get to that place. And there's a lot of great ways to wrap around that understanding. But I think that's a really, the direct path to understanding. I think if you go back to Ramana Maharshi, who people cite quite a bit, obviously is one of the great advanced consciousnesses of the last century. And, he still, his teachings are, quite relevant because it was the reasonably modern era that we actually had a very enlightened being that was, there. But he was, he described these states of being, and I didn't understand it when I first read his teachings at all. But I've recently had this experience. I just wanted to flesh this out because I think it's at a level of identification of this base observing joy, kind of calm, never changing self that is with us at all times. That it's not something to find, it's something to relax the mind, relax our identification with this experience enough to where we were able to notice it. And where I it really like abruptly kind of jarred me. I was sleeping and I became aware of my awareness in my sleep. And the only reason I recognize it is at some point the book, I had an Audible playing. I think it was a David Hawkins book, actually, an Audible playing, through the night. And I became aware of the sound of the Audible. And I realized that I had been aware for quite a while, but I wasn't hearing anything because I was still asleep. And that base of self is that constant self that's in all three states of awakeness, dream state, and deep sleep. Your conscious self, your higher level self, is the same at all times, and you're actually in that state of highest self in your deep delta, REM sleep.
Yeah, I think sleep is a very active spiritual area. It's not random. It's not crazy. It's there's a lot goes on in sleep.
Yeah, for sure. So that's I may have gone down a deep rabbit hole that is may not make sense to everyone at this stage, but I think I think what we're both talking about in our own way is and I like non-attachment better than detachment, but it's a non-attachment to the goings on, the things that are going on around us, our thoughts, feelings, emotions, the physical things we're seeing. It doesn't mean you don't have a preference. Doesn't mean that we don't want a good outcome. We want our team to win the game. We want our kid to do well. We want deals to close. Like, those are all normal, and there's nothing wrong with having a preference of an outcome, as long as we're not completely attached to that. If we can have non-attachment, we're okay with whether the deal closes or not. We're okay if we win the race or we don't win the race. We're okay if we get this new position or we don't get this new. We're okay if this relationship happens or it doesn't. Because we're very solidly aligned with our higher self, and at the end of the day, that doesn't change. And we can still have preferences. Detachment, I don't like the word. Some teachers use it. I don't like it as much because we want to be part of this experience. It's not that the inner world and our connection to higher self is the only thing that matters, and the rest of what we experience as humans don't matter. We're here for a reason, and we're in this experience to experience it and to live life fully. It's just not to be caught up in it. Once you, as Rupert says, once you recognize that this state that we're in right now is actually more like a dream to our higher self. And once we can realize that, like, this is really a dream, why would you do anything other than live fully? Like, we should experience this to the maximum possible. What does that look like? Doesn't mean being a daredevil and riding off a cliff on a motorcycle, but it means living fully, whether that's following your passion to write, and as you did, and you articulate so well, and we won't get into all that stuff because we can't, but what you pursued was your passion, and to do that. And I think that's where people get caught up, and that where this discussion might be useful is that you don't have to go to the extreme of, I want to be enlightened, and you drop everything else and you go live in a cave. I mean, that might have been appropriate culturally and at certain times in history. I think the challenge of our time is to wake up, become enlightened to the degree that we wish to and want and are able to, which everyone can do it. Everyone can do it. Just you have to make the decision to do it, and then there's a lot of work to be done, but it's doable. And to live in the world. So, that's, for me, that's been the interesting challenge is getting to that level to recognize the higher self. And I could be happy going to that mountain and literally living in a cave and not talking to anybody. I could do that all, like, it would make me very happy. And to still be engaged, to still do my role in the world, to do the things I do with family and business and YPO, all the different things I'm active in, and helping give back with homelessness and all that stuff. Like those are all things like I'm not interested in dropping while I'm also raising my consciousness level.
No, but also I think it's good to think about that there doesn't have to be this extreme contrast between a peaceful, meditative, spiritual life and an engaged, busy life in the world. And it's interesting how some really enlightened people have described this thing. And Hawkins is one of the best. And one of the things that he said was that normally when you hear sounds, you sort of hear them against a background of silence. So whether it's music or someone talking or a bird singing or any sound at all, it takes place against a background of silence. That's your default assumption and feeling about life. But once you begin to become more engaged with God and with your higher self and with goodwill and with avoiding negative feelings toward people and concentrating more on positive things, then all the sounds go into the background, and there's a silence around you. There's a silence around your thoughts and your feelings, and you can still hear what's going on. You're not going to miss anything that you need to, you're not going to get hit by a car, but you're like under a blanket of silence. So this is one way. Another is Tom Campbell talks about how our mission is to decrease entropy. He looks at, he describes love really as a process of decreasing entropy, so making things better. And so he actually had out-of-body experiences as a child, and he became adept at it and became a physicist and so on. But he also developed remote viewing and all these things. And so he kind of lives in a trance. And he describes this, and when he talks, you can kind of see that he's really in this other world more than he's with you. But he's saying very intelligent and helpful things. But you get a feeling from him of how he's got this blanket of silence and meditation and stuff going on while he's engaging with you.
Yeah, I think that's a great point as we wind down this part of our discussion, which obviously we have a lot of other things to talk about in a part 2 down the road. But I think you make a great point, which is it's not complete unawareness versus complete enlightenment that we're talking about. In general, it's a continuum, and at any increase in consciousness that one can experience and embody and bring their, call it, center of gravity to, any increase is good for them, their life, and all of the world and society. So, Rome wasn't built in a day. There's all these sayings about like things, I think God probably, didn't take 7 days to build the universe, it's constantly happening, as you say, but it also could be happening in an instant, right? It's every instant it's recreated is actually what's happening. So, it's all that stuff in Genesis, but every instant, right? But
right.
So, I think the idea that people can just pick one small thing and do it rigorously, consistently, relentlessly, unceasingly, that one thing will act as like a scalpel that cuts to the core of things that are holding you back. And it's like an avalanche in a mountain, like a giant mountain with snow on it. It doesn't happen, and then that one final snowflake drops on the mountain, and there's a avalanche of avalanches, and it just, cascades down. That's how enlightenment happens for people. So it can happen in an instant, it can happen slowly, gradually over time, and then in an instant it can happen very quickly. But the thing that the scalpel, the thing that snowflake that's adding to the pile, if you're conscious and intentional about it, you will make progress no matter what. And that one thing could be as simple as, I'm going to be kind to everyone at all times, including myself. Right. So if you make an exception and you are kind to everyone, and then when you're on your inner thoughts, you're beating yourself up because you messed up something, you didn't do this, you didn't do that, and you're beating yourself up in negative self-talk, that's not consistent. That's not what I'm talking about. You'd have to actually be kind to yourself and everyone else in order for this to work. Or pick something else. Respect all life in all its forms, from a flower to a beetle to your dog to people, and at all times just have a love of life and appreciation for it, and no exceptions. So there's a bunch of these things, and meditation can be a part of this. But I think it's literally, don't try to do it all at once. Just pick something and do it consistently. That's why the Course in Miracles is so great. I really enjoyed doing it. And although I didn't see the point of doing it every day for a while, after I did the entire course, the workbook, which is 365 days of lessons, I think it actually took me a year and a half because of travel and missing days and then doing catch up. But anyway, at the end of the day, I did the whole thing. And once you've done the whole thing, what you've done is you have committed to something, and you have thought about God, you thought about a higher power, you've been working on, and it's a scalpel. You're working on beliefs, you're embracing forgiveness, you're doing exercises to do that. And you can't, like you said, you can't just forgive somebody, your enemy from the old days, just by saying, I forgive them. But I forgive them is a start. And then if you work with that, at some point there's going to be a snowflake that causes the avalanche that just opens up the world to you.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this has been awesome. I think we have a lot of other things to talk about. You did a really nice job of answering a lot of questions, which I think is going to turn into a book for you. Frankly, I think that would be awesome to turn that into an actual book. But that stuff will be published along with this episode, at least the summary of your answers. And if people want to look at your work, I mean, obviously a lot of that stuff, we have links to a bunch of stuff in your answers, which will take people there. I know you've got a website, you're LukeWallin.com, correct?
Yeah.
And so it's been awesome having you on, and I love having this conversation in a format. There's Anitra behind us. She made the video. In a format that we can share with others a little bit of our conversation, because I would say that this is not atypical to what we talk about on a regular basis.
Right. We have these kind of conversations every week, and we go into all kinds of things, including the things that we don't understand. It's not like we understand everything.
No, what we know is that we don't know. That's what we know. But the things that we're figuring out, we're like, oh, like this makes sense. So we should share some of that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the more you understand, the less you actually know, and the more you can stay in that present moment of trusting this divine experience we're having. And with that, I thank you for all this energy and these stories, and we will to be continued.
Thank you also. This is great.
Awesome. Thank you.
They caught my daddy in the woods last night. Said they saw his shining light. Said they heard his rifle clear. He shot the rich man's deer. he shot the rich man's deer. They call me a redneck, poacher's son. Tell them I'm proud to be one. I'll see you down the barrel of my gun. I'll see you down the barrel of my gun. Now Daddy's in the county jail, his truck is on the city lot, rifles hanging on the wall of the sheriff's den. Trailer's leaking in the rain, Mama's cussing Daddy's name, says he's gonna beat us all when he gets home again. When he gets home again. They call me a redneck, poacher's son. Tell them I'm proud to be one. I'll see you down the barrel of my gun. I'll see you down the barrel of my gun. Daddy got his whiskey down, took me by the hand. Got his whiskey bottle down, took me by the hand. Said, son, you know I'm just as good as any other man. I gotta live outside the law, cause I ain't got no land. Cause I ain't got no land.